welcome to our fifth full episode of the Japan Startup Megaphone podcast. We are going to interview many people on this podcast, but today's really kind of a special one because we're talking to our dai-senpai, the person who is, sort of the real innovator of podcasts about the startup world in Japan. He is Tim Romero, and he's a Tokyo-based author and entrepreneur. And it is his Disrupting Japan podcast, of which we are just a very small and late-coming follower. It's good to talk to somebody who's way ahead of us in this field. Romero has been here on the Japan startup scene for nearly a quarter century. He started in the late 1990s. So we talked to him a little bit about how it is that about 6 or 7 years ago, he decided to start his Disrupting Japan podcast and what he has learned during that time. We also found out why he chose podcasts and what he expected to get from his podcast when he launched it, and what he did get over the time that he's been doing it. Of course, one of the things we did learn, which we were expecting to hear about, is that things have really been developing in the not so much the podcast world, but in the startup world in Japan. Whereas it was much smaller half a decade ago, today the whole ecosystem, the support network, and the sophistication of the companies is really growing. And we got some details about that straight from somebody who knows an awful lot about it. And we also, of course, since we are talking to a media guy, we wanted to get his take on how good is the news coverage of the startup world in Japan, and he had a lot of interesting things to say about that. Okay, well, enough for my introduction. Let's go ahead and jump into the podcast, and you can hear straight from Tim Romero, our predecessor, and the guy who is leading the field in podcasts for the kinds of things that we're covering here. All right. Well, thank you, Tim, for joining us today. We're very excited to have sort of, our senpai in this field join us for the first time. So thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
All right. Well, I think anybody who follows the issue of startups in Japan, I mean, your name is one of the first ones that jumps out because you are the Disrupting Japan podcast guy. So what I really want to know first is how did that come about? And, how did you kind of get into that connection of worlds?
Yeah, I've been starting companies in Japan for over 20 years now. Started my first company in 1998. And the podcast really just, in a way, I just kind of started it on a lark. I just thought I'd sit down with some of my founder friends and talk a bit, which is technically still what I'm doing. But I never thought it would have more than a couple hundred listeners. And just over time, there's just every month, there's more and more people. There's this tremendous interest about Japanese innovation, not just in Japan, but globally. And we've got about 10,000 listeners per show now, which is pretty good for such a niche targeted podcast. But that's the great thing about podcasts.
Well, let's start with that right there. I mean, why podcast? I mean, there's many formats that potentially a series about startups in Japan could go into. Why did you choose podcast?
So I write prolifically. I've had over 200 articles published in English and Japanese about innovation and startups in Japan. And I don't mean like blog posts. I mean in like print magazines and newspapers and things like that. And that's great. I love doing that. But that always felt like kind of a broadcast. You can't really have a conversation or get into the sort of things I wanted to talk about. You're really boxed in with a column format. And I looked at things like video. And it's just, oh my God, video is so much work. I mean, it's crazy. It's not like twice as much work as just audio. It's like 4 or 5 times. You got lighting and it just seemed like the the right medium, just sit down and have a conversation. And so I really, it was more of the medium gave me an opportunity to try something rather than me having this grand vision and trying to decide which medium to use.
And it was some years ago that you started. How many years ago was it now?
This is, I guess we're in season 7. So doing this for 6.5 years.
And at that time, I mean, podcasts are now sort of, I guess, better established than they were then. So, weren't you originally concerned that you'd be doing a podcast for nobody instead of 10,000 people?
No, no, I was fully expecting to do a podcast for, well, not nobody, but I was fully expecting to do a podcast for maybe a couple hundred people, like my friends and my startup circle. So I was totally fine going into this project.
Hmm. Another thing I very much admire is the artwork for your Disrupting Japan, the name and the Godzilla figure marching through the city of Tokyo. It's very, very cool. And so can you kind of tell us a little bit about how that came about?
Yeah, I've got to get like a hat tip to my friend Dwight Waldron, who's one of my oldest friends in Japan. We've known each other longer than we care to admit. And he's been a graphic designer forever. And I just said, uh, I first farmed out the design on it was like Fiverr or 99 Designs or one of these crowdsourcing, and it was really this kind of uninspired stuff. And so I called up my friend Dwight and said, "Hey, I'm looking for cover art for this podcast, and the designs I'm getting back are terrible." And he's like, "Well, what are you paying them?" And he's like, "You're kidding? People work for that?" I'm like, "Well, yeah." So he said, "Okay, I'll do you a design." And a week later, he called me up and he's like, "Okay, Tim, I've got 3 designs for you, but you only need to look at the first one." I'm like, "All right." And it was like, "Okay, yeah, you're right. That you nailed it. That was it was just right." Um, and it's interesting that we don't have we're very careful on IP. So we're not using a picture of Godzilla. Dwight actually ran out to one of those 99-cent stores and bought a toy Godzilla and like took pictures of it. So it's yeah, that's it's again, it's just me and my friends.
And
The
that
way
was,
all great projects start.
I mean, the Godzilla thing was all his idea because that was a very cool way to translate what you are doing.
I thought it was perfect. It was just like on the nose.
All right. Um, and so, all right, well, let's get into it a little bit more. So, you've done many episodes, as you say, for 6.5 years or so. Um, when you're going about selecting guests and topics, do you have any sort of guidelines in mind, or has there been an evolution in the way that you're approaching that issue?
Yeah, it's what I'm looking for is I'm looking for interesting stories and like my ideal episode. What I'm trying to get at in every episode is highlighting some unique aspect of Japanese society or Japanese business as told through the lens of this particular startup founder. Um, so some of the people that have been on the show, they're not necessarily the most famous founders, but it's really fun to do it that way. So when I did Disrupting Japan professionally for about a year, and when I did that, you kind of have an obligation to grow your user base, and that means getting more and more famous people, getting more clicks, getting and it takes you away from kind of the fun storytelling part. So I'm looking for interesting stories more than anything else.
So, and like I said, was there kind of an evolution in the way that you dealt with that, or has it been pretty much the same through the time?
There's been some evolution. I think I've become more conscious and deliberate about the stories I'm trying to tell. But I think the biggest change has been in the startup ecosystem itself. Just in the space of 6 or 7 years, the founders have gotten a lot more knowledgeable and sophisticated. There's been a real societal shift. So early on, like one question I don't bother asking anymore. Early on, I would ask everyone about their origin story. And everyone had stories about how like their wife hated it or their mother-in-law wouldn't let that happen, or their parents were threatening to disown them for not going into a proper company, or one guy was homeless when he started his company. the really intense, powerful stories. And now it's mostly like, oh, well, this VC wanted to fund me and my friends and I think it's really a good idea. My family's supportive. So like, why not? And that's awesome. That's a great place for the ecosystem to be, but man, it doesn't make for great storytelling.
And what
So
about?
the change in,
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, the change in the ecosystem, the change in society is been the biggest driver to the change in the podcast.
Okay, well, I want to come back to that, but before I do, I want to ask about the language issue. I mean, you know, we are covering, a Japanese business section here, but we're in a country where, if we're doing our podcast in English, not, it seems to be only a minority of folks who have a real facility to speak English. So how do you deal with that issue? How do you navigate that?
I spend a lot of time in post. Post production on Disrupting Japan is it's an ordeal. So no, I mean I'm speaking with people who are not speaking their native language usually. So I'll the conversations we have are maybe an hour to an hour and a half. I'll edit that down to 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes. And there's a lot of editing of just pauses and ums and sometimes people need to stop and say, wait, how do I say this in English again? And I'll explain it. And all that gets cut out in post and it's this great snappy conversation. And my guests constantly tell me like, oh, my friends listen to this and everyone keeps telling me they didn't know I spoke such good English.
That's excellent. Yeah, I understand that. I haven't tried to do too many interviews with Japanese people yet, but that's definitely going to be something I'll be dealing with later. Getting back to the question about how things evolved, I mean, as someone who has been, tracing this for the years that you have, how much progress have you seen in that time in not just the podcast, but in the startup world in Japan?
I think there's a lot of different ways to measure it. So I mean, it is simply bigger. There's a lot more money being invested in it. But I think the more important thing is the sophistication and focus of the founders is advancing just really quickly. There's a Japan Society for the last 7, 8 years have been giving these awards to uh, innovative Japanese startups and innovative US startups. And I've been involved with that since the beginning. And, when we first started out, you couldn't really hold the Japanese founders up to the ones that were coming from Silicon Valley. There was a definite gap. But now there's not. I mean, the Silicon Valley, the startups have more money. They're better funded. Um, there's easier access to customers, but the founders themselves, the strategies they're executing are world class. They're right up where they need to be, which I guess we shouldn't be too surprised at because all of this info is out on the internet. I mean, people who want to learn it can. Founders network among themselves. A lot of my guests, know each other. It's not that big of a community, although it's getting bigger, which is great.
Do you feel that young Japanese who are, growing up in this country through the education system here, see startups as a viable career path for them, or are they still largely, wanting to hang on towards the secure lifetime employment practices?
Well, I see a change, but my friends are always quick to remind me that I kind of live in a bubble. Like all the people around me are startup founders, they're people doing innovative things, and that may not represent mainstream Japan. So, but I do see things like there is entrepreneurship being taught in high school. I've worked with high school students on like coaching and running like not building actual startups, but kind of simulating that process, what it takes to bring a product to market. And they're passionate and interested. So the seed is there. How widespread it is, I'm not sure.
What about the general ecosystem? I mean, like, for example, what would you say are the strong points of the startup ecosystem in Japan as we stand today? And what areas really need to develop further for it to really launch into, world-class, world-beating startups here?
Well, I think the probably the most significant change in the startup ecosystem is in any ecosystem anywhere, there's like this tipping point. So when I was starting my first startups back, in the dot-com era, everyone, all the startup founders, we needed to find, usually like a main primary customer. That would be our source of cash flow. That's what we were focused on. But now there's a real ecosystem where many of the startups, their customers are other startups. They're selling and doing business with each other. And that allows innovation to be deployed much more quickly because other startups will use new technology much faster than enterprises. And they can take those success cases to enterprises. I think that kind of critical mass is like the tipping point, and we've hit that now in Japan, certainly in Tokyo. Some of the outside of Tokyo, less so. Then the other big change is that um, like 20 years ago, it was almost impossible for me as a founder to sell to a large Japanese organization. If I wanted to sell to an NEC or Fujitsu or whoever, I'd be pushed down through like, four levels of subcontractors. And now every company in Japan has, startup outreach and innovation programs that they want to engage directly with startups. And that's just been fantastic. Where they have to grow, I think a lot of it's just like there needs to be more of the same there, but I think there also needs to be a much greater desire to go global, to go outside of Japan. There needs to be an increased awareness of what's happening outside Japan in terms of competition, in terms of good ideas. But I mean, things are really heading in the right direction. And a lot of it depends what you compare it to. So when you look and say, well, let's compare Tokyo and San Francisco, yeah, Japan looks like it's way, way behind. But if you say, okay, well, let's compare Tokyo to Tokyo 10 years ago, and it's like, it's incredible how much things have progressed and changed.
Forgive me for breaking in the middle of this very interesting discussion, but we need your help. This podcast is being run by Akihabara News under the mother company Shingetsu News Agency, and in order to continue such discussions in the future, we're really going to need some support from our listeners and from our readers. So please consider giving us a donation at our Patreon account. The Patreon account is under the name Shingetsu News Agency. And if you find Patreon, then you will be able to find our account as well. So please consider helping us out and making sure that we can have content like this going forward for many, many years. All right, now back to the podcast. What about the issue of exits? I mean, are there really enough or big enough, win stories in Japan at this point?
Yeah, I think better. I think the key to exits is not necessarily the IPOs. The road to IPO is pretty smooth in Japan now. They've changed the laws. Most Japanese IPOs are really pretty low valuation. I think what really needs to develop, and is just starting to develop, is the mergers and acquisition part of it. So large companies who are buying startups for strategic reasons. And this is still kind of a new concept in Japan. So traditionally, M&A, merger and acquisition, has been distressed assets. You buy a company that's about to go bankrupt because you can buy the factories really cheaply, or they've got a customer base you can acquire cheaply. And most of Japanese history, that's what M&A was. So the idea of saying, okay, we want to move into this new market. This startup has some great technology and great talent. Let's buy them. It's still new. It's starting to happen, but I think there's a lot of progress that still needs to be made there. But I think that the IPO side seems pretty solid. Companies can take that option when they want to, but we need more progress from the large enterprise side.
Hmm. I am seeing a lot more about sort of incubator projects and hubs and things like this. How is that going? I mean, is that already enough for what is needed, or is it still pretty
It's a mixed
small?
bag. I think like in general, that kind of activity is good. There is, I mean, so conceptually, in the abstract, yeah, it is great to have founders and freelancers and creative people like gather together and exchange ideas. That's absolutely critical. So some of the startup hubs really provide that functionality. They have these communities. It's and they're doing a lot of good. Others really are more like just office space rental and then like rebranded. So in general, yeah, it's very important. But as like a founder or a freelancer who wants to participate, your mileage may vary. You'll have to check out a few different places before you find one that you really feel like you fit.
With you, I want to particularly talk about the media issue since you're, I think, well, fairly clearly the leading media person in terms of Japanese startups. Um, how about coverage of startups as you see in Japan? Is it, I mean, you could talk about both the English language press and the Japanese language press. Has it been changing? Is it where it needs to be?
Um, the amount of coverage is better, but it's not necessarily the right type of coverage. So mainstream Japanese press still views startups as this kind of esoteric, interesting side, uh, like side project. It's not the main show. The really important stuff is what's happening in the large enterprises, the brands and the names we all know, and they get the focus. And then like, oh yeah, there's also this startup thing. But it tends to get covered as if there's something fundamentally different. And I think that's got to change, but I don't think it's going to be the mainstream media suddenly deciding it needs to be changed. I think it's going to be startups, enough of them kind of like breaking through and kind of showing Japan, forcing the media to change the narrative around startups. Now, after that, there's a whole lot of kind of secondary media that is bloggers and podcasts like Disrupting Japan and dedicated forums and things like that. That's really active and dynamic. But the mainstream media, it's not quite where we need to be. But I think that's the founders are going to have to kind of like force the kind of coverage that we want.
Well, my first question on is why. I mean, good journalists should be on a story, and if you're a business journalist, and certainly you're hearing about startups all the time, why aren't they really getting into it? Why isn't I don't know, whichever paper, the Nikkei or whatever major news organization, why isn't it covering them in the way that they need to be covered?
I don't know. I think a lot of it is just kind of inertia and tradition. And I mean, startups do get covered and they get overwhelmingly positive coverage. But it's always if an article is focused on the importance on like Japan's future, on weighty economic issues, they tend to go like, well, here's what the real companies think. Um, Startups they're getting more and more exposure when they're talking about innovation, the need for creativity, but it's still covered as kind of a different thing. It's not covered as like the real business yet. And I think it's just inertia more than anything else. Startups are still kind of new. And I think as we get more large, successful startups, we might see that shift.
Could it possibly be that there's no sort of Keidanren of startups? No, there aren't these interest groups that push their agenda forward, or are there?
There's a handful, but I think it's more. the startups, the startups doing important things changes year to year. So any organization like that will be out of date in 2 years. Um, I think a lot of it has to do with the way press is disseminated, the way that the way press conferences are run. Most startups just don't have the manpower or the connections to run press campaigns, media interaction that way. Now, as they get bigger, they start playing the press game the way that Japanese companies are expected to, and they do tend to get proper coverage. And there's a very significant difference in the way that the press will cover a company post IPO and pre IPO. But again, to be fair, that's not just the press. A number of founders on the show have told me that one of their primary motivations for going public was so that they'd be taken more seriously by not just the press, but by their own customers. It would allow them to do deals and make strategic alignments with bigger, serious enterprises.
Is what are these founders? I mean, since you know some, what are they reading? I mean, are they reading the Nikkei every day, or do they have their own sort of trade publications or niche magazines or anything that they're looking at in general?
I don't know. I wouldn't want to speak to that. I'm not sure. I think if I did take a survey of all of them, we would get a huge variety of answers for that. Um, but I do think most of the founders I've talked to, there tends to be this underlying passion or underlying interest that brought them into entrepreneurship, and that's totally outside of business. And it might be some part of medicine, or it might be some aspect of AI. And usually the founder will have some really deep, passionate interest in that focus as well. So it's definitely not just reading business press.
Okay. Uh, well, I think I know what your answer has to be for this, but how much optimism do you have about the future of the startup community in Japan? I mean, is it going to be on the size of a US or a Europe or an India or a China, or is it always going to be a little bit handicapped here, do you think?
I think I don't think it's going to get to the size of the US, but I think it's going to develop quite differently here. I think that we're going to see things like Japanese universities are going to have a much, much larger role to play than they do in the US. Japanese enterprises tend to be willing to form these much longer term commitments and longer term business relationships with startups that just aren't possible in the US. On both sides, it's too transactional. So I think with things like this in place, you get lower valuations because you don't need as much money. Um, so I don't think that Japan will get to the size and the valuations we see in the US anytime soon. I don't think that's a problem. I don't think that's necessarily a desirable place to be. That shouldn't be the target. But I am really optimistic about it. I mean, I think it's impossible to look at what's happened in the last 10 years and not be incredibly optimistic about what's happening with startups and innovation in Japan.
Well, taking from what you just said there, what role should startups start playing within Japan, within the Japanese economy? Where do they fit in terms of bringing Japan forward?
Well, I think startups are doing the right thing already. And I think that this generation of founders, as opposed to like the dot-com generation, this generation is much more focused on disruption. They are much more willing to take on large enterprises and say, no, we want that business. We're not just looking for partnerships. I mean, they don't say that in public, obviously. We have to have, harmony must be maintained. But there is this desire to shake things up, to grow, to do things differently. And that's what startups are for. um, startups are not just like scaled down versions of large companies. Startups are out there to develop and test a new business model. Um, they're expected to fail because most hypotheses,
Hypotheses.
hypotheses. Thank you. Most theories um, turn out to be wrong, right? So I think that the current generation of startups has kind of accepted that, okay, most are going to fail. That's okay. We don't have to play nice with everyone. It's okay to take people's business if we're doing it better. So I'm incredibly encouraged by what I see. On the startup side, I think it's absolutely the right dynamic.
Well, we hope you enjoyed that treat. I know that I certainly enjoyed this discussion with Tim Romero, and learned a lot. Uh, I don't know exactly when our next podcast in this series will be, but it shouldn't be before too much longer. But thank you for joining us, and with the support that you may be able to give us through Patreon, hopefully we can do these even more often. And ultimately, there may be guest hosts as well. Nothing arranged at this moment, but that is part of our concept. Anyway, thank you for joining us, and have a great week, a great month, and keep on rocking.